So my name is Zamcheck, or Abby for short, and this is a topic that I'm very passionate about because it's a subject which is so meaningful. It goes to what's the heart of the meaning of culture, why do we study it, and what's the future role of it. And there's actually a big debate about key issues in this. Forgive me, this title is a bit bold. It's a debate about future architecture, so there's many debates. But to me, this is the one that is quite central over the last few years, that sometimes there's not enough discussion, and sometimes that there should be, because it's seen as too much for experts to talk about. But actually, experts, so-called experts, myself, I'm still learning the field, learn from discussions with everyone about this. So I very much look forward to people's feedback and questions and comments as much as anything. So I hope to talk not too long, but it's a tough subject because it deals with thousands of years of history and the modern scholarship. So there's a bunch of material to go through, but I'll have to be clear and concise. Okay. So just what we're going to go over. One is the background of Liang Sicheng, who he passed away in 1971, and was kind of thought of as the founding scholar of modern Chinese architecture. And he was his father is very renowned. We're talking about in a second, Yunjing. He and his wife Yunjing was very as important as he was to the field study at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1920s, and had a very interesting career. His ideas actually changed about the field, but some ideas stayed the same. He has very strong ideas about how to understand the field, what its rise and fall, how do we appreciate it is not an unchanging history, but that actually we can see certain dynasties have certain importance and sometimes declining in the tradition as well, which is somewhat controversial. So we'll get into that in a second. I think we just jump ahead. And to focus on this idea a little bit and talk about different views of the Dogo, or sometimes called the Chinese bracket, some of the debate about his views versus others in recent years, to understand the rise and fall, as he would say, or some would say actually the opposite, maybe. What he thought was a high point in this engineering was a lower point, and this helps understand some of the larger discussions about this field. As I talk, I realize I'm from New York, and we talk very fast in New York, and we have an international audience, so I'll try to slow down a bit. I want to get through though quickly. And from there, another debate, which this is enclosed with, is the idea of what's the role of what we say monumental architecture, or some would say the role of official versus vernacular architecture. This idea of Yunjing versus Yunjing, the official versus the folk of vernacular tradition. And some people think that Liang was too attracted to palaces, and so we'll talk about how this plays out right now. And from there, kind of look at his wider work to see how he synthesized these various questions over time, and then get into the question and answer. Does that sound good? So clear so far? Okay. So some basic background about Liang Sicheng's basic approach, and I already hinted at this before, but he believed that the tradition needs to be seen as not static. There's this idea abroad sometimes, but also sometimes within China too, that history is almost unknowable, that it doesn't change. And Liang Sicheng saw that as part of the culture of emulation in China too, that actually we need to understand that history, like any history, has times of inventions, that there's different forms of architecture and different dynastic periods. It's not unchanging. And there was this bias that came somewhat from foreign scholars from the West at times, but sometimes this has been really taken up in China too, to say actually you can't say that the tradition changes in the same way that the West does. I just wanted to read a little summary of this concept here. But pivotal to this is Liang Sicheng's father, who very much was a key reformer. If people don't know him in the audience, Chinese students and teachers no doubt do, but I would look him up. His idea was that both we can understand Chinese history through the literary tradition, but also that there is a scientific history in China that can meet the West in its own terms and exceed it, that there's no idea that the West and China needs to be separate. So he was part of the modernization movement in the country as well, and very much what's called towards pragmatism or something called 经验主义, that you could actually learn from looking at the object. And this was seen as a correction to just seeing the tradition through the literary record. And this is important because in China there's often a lack of existing architecture because of various historical reasons. So in the past, people learned more about the architecture from what was written about it. And the idea among the reformers, especially friends of Liang Sicheng, so Zhu Jiqian, was that we could actually study from the archaeological record and actually start to have a more rigorous understanding of the development of the architecture. And this was related, this is people, if you recognize, people probably, some people know who the person in the rear right is, by show of hands. Who could recognize that person? That's Hu Shi in China. So I guess he's not as famous now as he was in the past, but very important. He was the person who started the vernacular movement in China, the 5 Hua. And the person in front of him, probably everyone knows well, that's John Dewey. And he came to China in 1919. He's the founder of the pragmatist philosophy, this idea that you learn from experience. And he became a celebrity in 1919, right during the May 4th movement. And the reason I bring this up is because behind the architecture, there's this, the architectural theorists, there was moved towards learning from the real object. And there's this idea that this was part of modernization at the time. And Hu Shi was good friends with Liang Sicheng. And the founder of the Yinzao Shui Shi, Zhu Jiqian, was very much in their circle. So they were very much part of this trend of kind of learning from research and breaking away from the tradition to a certain extent as a correction, as they saw, to the idea of the feudal culture that needed to be broken with to a degree. So this is something to keep in mind as we go forward. This is Lin Huiyin and Liang Sicheng. So this is when they were married. I don't know why this keeps them jumping ahead. In 1929. And so as I mentioned, they studied at the University of Pennsylvania. Though they're graduates. Liang Sicheng was a graduate of Tsinghua. And Lin Huiyin convinced him to study architecture. And she was as much, as I mentioned, important to his theory as Liang Sicheng was. He believed very much that you have to understand the structure of Chinese architecture, that you can't just understand the formal role of it, that you understand that actually the structural components are key to understanding its ability to serve the present, but also, again, that the past is not unchanging, that we can understand a high point in the culture. And Liang Sicheng emphasized very much that we have a high point in the Tang Dynasty in terms of engineering, dialogue, openness. And we say this in China sometimes now, the Tang is seen as a high point, but Liang Sicheng, inspired by his father, really looked towards the Tang, and Lin Huiyin to extend even more to the Han Dynasty as high points in the tradition. So that's some basic background, but what we see here is kind of one view of the past and the monumental tradition. These are artistic representations of the Qing Dynasty palace, the Panggong. And something that Liang Sicheng emphasized in his work is what we understand from what we see, so even in Wugong or surrounding architecture in Yunjing, is not reflective of the whole historical past. That there sometimes was grandeur on a palatial scale in the capitals of the Han, Minhang. And something interesting about when we get from the Qing to the Han Dynasty is amazing connections between the palaces of the, you see the horizontal connections in the bottom right that kind of approach something of a super highway at the time for the upper class. And this is just to remind us that the emphasis on palaces by Liang Sicheng wasn't as much as he just believed, I would say, in the importance of a monument to something grand, but he thought that something that we could learn from the history, that there was something engineering-wise and social-wise that transcended what came after. And so then there's another view of how to understand Chinese architecture, as I mentioned, the vernacular tradition, the Yunjing, that you have this whole tradition of villages and beautiful residential buildings and bridges that are not built by the official state. And there's been some critiques in recent years that we need to focus more on this element of the tradition to understand Chinese architecture. So we see in a Hongcun, if you're in Anhui, something that's not what you would say in a palace, but also is very intricate. But just saying that this is a watercolor by Yun Yin, and people say that she didn't focus, that Liang didn't focus enough on the folk tradition, but they were very much moved by that too. They believe that this needed to be transmitted somehow into the present and preserved. So I would argue, I'm showing some of my bias here, but they weren't disconnected from this argument as well. So to get a little bit into this debate already, because that's what I promised, here are some voices in it. And the first one in the upper right is a book by a scholar from Taiwan called Han Baozi. And he had an argument that we're going to go into about the Dougong, that as opposed to what Liang Sicheng said, Liang said in the Tong, the Dougong, as we're going to see, was very robust and structurally important. The Yunjing, it was mostly an ornament, and Han Baozi, he says, well, Liang Sicheng says that's a decline. He says that's great. That architecture reaches its most supreme role when it's ornamental. He says that it's its spiritual meaning. So that's his basic argument. And there's some other arguments we'll get into in a minute. The book at the bottom is very popular among a lot of architects in China in the 90s. The mistake of elevation. And actually, in the introduction, he visited our school a year ago. He says he's very influenced by Han Baozi, in particular because Liang Sicheng in China was seen so much as the authority. So in this book, Jiao Chen, picking on Han Baozi's books, he has little observations of, for instance, what I mentioned, maybe Liang focused too much on the palaces, or maybe his understanding of elevation was inspired by the West too much, where we have the facade so much. And China doesn't have this idea because it's more of a modular understanding of the column construction inside. So different ideas to challenge some of Liang's role. And basically what I would recommend, I'm going to talk us through some of these ideas, but for those who want to get deeper, Yunjing is on the upper left. And he has an essay that talks about kind of the theoretical discussion here. And he says the basic thing is, do we understand architecture simply formally, or do we understand there's a relationship between engineering and form? And basically, he's defending Liang Sicheng, who is teacher at Shanghai, that this understanding, we cannot disregard structure in understanding of architectural history, very essential at the present moment. And this is actually Yunjing's view on the left. I just wanted to read a quote from Jiao Chen. He says, let's take a look at the official palace architecture that reflects imperial power. Liang Sicheng originally chose this topic for his research in Chinese architecture. He obviously estimated that in Chinese architectural culture, this type of architecture was the most exalted and best corresponded to and competed with the main trend of architecture of the West. And thus it was his choice for establishing the classicism of Chinese architecture. So basically, Jiao Chen says it's the West that's at fault here. And I just wanted to read one quote before I go further by the top American scholar of Chinese architecture, which humbly I have to say there's maybe one main scholar in the West, in America, that focuses on it, so we do better. But she's done a lot of good work in focusing on neglected parts of the tradition, especially the Liao dynasty, Nancy Steinhardt. And she says, on a similar topic, perhaps Liang viewed himself as a loyalist to an old regime in which intellectuals defined the course of Chinese society, and his presentation of an ideal image of Tang architecture as one of countless references to China's grand past might resurface at some future time. This scenario had served Chinese intellectuals in self-imposed retreat in earlier centuries, but at the end of the 20th century, it would warp the field of intellectual discourse. So, I know there's a lot there, but the main point I want to just highlight is Jiao Chen says the problem with Liang is he was Western. And Nancy Steinhardt in the University of Pennsylvania says the problem with Liang is he's part of the Chinese tradition. So it's kind of funny. One says the reason he's into palaces is because he's too Western, the other says he's too Chinese. So they're both saying the same thing, but using opposite justifications. I think it's a little funny. Anyway, a little sample of Liang's understanding of Chinese architecture. Liang really focused on these treatises of architecture that were discovered around his time. First being the Yizao Fa Shi, a Song Dynasty manual for how you build official construction. And there's many discoveries in it, including the grade of of the roofs at the time, and in particular the Taifan model. This is a modular way of building Chinese construction that's detailed in the manual by how you have modular units depending on the scale of building, that these measurements then can be reproduced in terms of the size of the columns and the beams. So you start from the size of the building and basing on that this unit is used. It makes it very easy to source material and produce proportional measurements. So a form of standardization in the Song Dynasty. And there's another text that he and Wei Yuzhen did, the regulations of the Qing Dynasty, a similar text of understanding the official understanding of the craft of building. And very hard, when he got the book, he was at the University of Penn. And he actually said to his father he wanted to study palaces, and his father cautioned him against it, saying there's not enough material, you should study the fine arts. But he persisted, and through Zhuqiqian, they had this copy of these things. And he said at first it was like an alien book, because there's the terminology changes over the centuries. So he spent years deciphering it, interviewing craftspeople, and for instance, people repairing bone, and over his life, annotated up to the 1960s, he was still producing annotations. So it's really an amazing lifetime's work, and worthy of people to be introduced to a degree. But again, this is criticized now by some as being too focused on the official tradition. If you're in Huizhou, in say Hongcun or lesser known villages, do you consider this treatise from the Song Dynasty? No. There's lineages of craftspeople tradition in China. So there's this criticism. So let's get into some ideas of the bracket. So this is a detail from Shanxi, and you see here it's from 857 AD. And if you can notice, what's amazing is the size of the bracket there. And here you see the the diagonal that is coming out to. Here's another view. It's kind of hard to appreciate if you're not used to Chinese architecture, but compared to the later dynasties, it's very robust structurally. And the roof also has a more soft decline, which is noted too. One of the important things about the bracket is it extends the roof as well. One of the reasons people speculate that bracket might have fallen in use after also is because the climate changed in China from being more temperate during the Tang and became more stormy afterwards and cold. But so you can see this, that there's also different sizes. It's hard to see between the brackets on the side and the middle. They're not all standardized. They become standardized later on. And there's not the subject of this top, but also very amazing roof structure in the ones, including this triangular roof support that stops being used after the Yuan Dynasty. It becomes just a column of beam construction. And this was also very interesting to Liang Sicheng. That's him discovering it in 1937 in the roof in the Fogong Temple, which was very hard to get to at the time. The other thing about Liang Sicheng and Li Guiyin is they had to travel on donkey to very, very difficult conditions with very few provisions to survey sites throughout the country, just based on Jiao Tong or different local gazetteers. There was no comprehensive understanding of what existed in the country at the time. And so they and their colleagues at the Society for Research in Chinese Architecture, in very difficult times, this is wartime when Japan had invaded China, and they thought as a race against time to catalog what was there. They were afraid it wouldn't exist afterwards. And so these are the foundation of our field, to a degree, arguably, their contributions at the time. But so yeah, very unique modular construction of the Tong. Very scientific, and you can actually, the supports are passed to the columns very methodically in the structure. So you see just a brief example for a Qing Dynasty. You don't have that triangular support of the roof. This is just to show one of the many examples. It's not engineering changes over time. And it's something that we really emphasize, that to respect the mission, you need to understand not just the facade level, but the inner functioning of structure. That's very key to their approach. This is just a little example inside Fogong Temple. One thing interesting about later temples in China you might observe is not as many of the deities inside, because some people say it's because people realize that people wanted to go to different temples, and if you spread out the deities more, it's better for commerce, not people visit one site after another, not putting them all in one place. But this is in 857, very early. Things are still much crowd in the center. It's more sort of Indian tradition where people would revolve around the temple, versus later, increasingly in China, there's a tradition of the temples becoming more like government halls where you come to see the emperor, you come to see the gods, so linear as opposed to circular. So it's little things to keep in mind. This is a detail from the Yao Dynasty Dogong. It's a very robust, structurally very intricate. And just fast forwarding to Taipei, Beijing, during the Qing Dynasty, it's hard to see, but those are all Dogong on the top. And you can see closer up here. And maybe you see they're very beautiful, but they're not structurally important anymore. They're simply ornamental at this point. Here's another detail. You see the on are before part of this angular construction that is no longer used structurally, but still symbolic. And this is from Han Bao's book, and he has some interesting observations. I don't need to discount his work. It's worth reading. It's kind of interesting thoughts. And he says this is not a work of scholarship, it's more of a thought piece, but it has played a very important role still in debate in China. And he says, well, in the Han Dynasty, Dogong, you see the one on the right there, it doesn't really have a structural role. He thinks it must be symbolic or religiously significant. So he sees this religious association with Dogong from the very start in the Han Dynasty as being its main function. And this is totally different from Yang Sicheng and Minhang's idea of understanding that first you have use, and then you have ideas, associations from that. Han Bao is the opposite. First there's the formal idea, and the use is secondary. So very different interpretations. Something interesting about the columns here, you might think that they look some sort of Western architecture, like ancient Greece. And there's something more of a convergence in ancient history architecturally between the East and West. But another interesting thing that Han Bao says is he notices that in Nepal you have this sort of temple here, and these bracket supports, which seems similar to him in the Han Dynasty images here. And it's an interesting point. So he actually has the idea that maybe the Dogong originated from India or Nepal, which is somewhat controversial because we think of Dogong as so Chinese. But Han Bao is kind of trying to wake us up. Well, maybe it came from India. He doesn't have proof, but it's something to think about. And one of the things that Liang Sicheng's education in the West at the time, there wasn't as much understanding of Indian architecture, at least in the main academies. So when he talks about the role of the origin of architecture, say in Yunjing Sheku, the Yunnan grottos, for instance, which are built in the Northern Wei Dynasty before the Swearing Tong, you have this, as if you're in India almost. Actually, I think Monica's in the audience, and we talked about this in our class, that she's from India, and it seems very Indian, but Liang Sicheng sees it as evidence of culture transmitted from the West through India. So there is maybe a need since that more emphasis on what actually was transmission through India, through ancient India at the time too. And overall in the field of Chinese architecture, we're talking about the association of different cultures interacting with each other. And over the course of his work, actually through the 50s and 60s, Liang talks more about this. But in the 1930s, because China was under foreign invasion, there was a very pressing need to define what is the Chinese essence of the architecture at the time. So I think you could see this reflected somewhat in these conclusions of his from his understandings of Yunjing, what is actually the foundation. Later, when things get a little more stable, there's more room to be more in dialogue with other cultures a bit. Talk about that in a second. This is another approach to Yingzhou Fasha that's become of interest lately. Is there's the language of flower metaphor in the Dogong. So this is from Feng Jiran's interesting book called Chinese Architecture and Metaphor. And so there's all these references to the petal in the terminology, so he says that this is important, that is neglected in some of the studies before. And there's something to say that Liang Sicheng and Lin Guoying, they couldn't do everything, and their colleagues couldn't do anything. There's more to the field. So it's different things to keep in mind. So let's talk a little bit, let's see what time we're at, the idea of monumental architecture, the palace. How do people talk about this now? So this is an image that Liang referred to in his earliest essay on Buddhist palace, Tang palaces and temples from 1932. It's in Minhang, or the Gansu province, way far in the west. And this is a portrayal of where he saw how unified planning is existed in the Tang Dynasty, that you have courtyards connected on a very wide scale. And basically, Liang Sicheng at the time, he was very young at the time, one of his first essays, compares this to the literary record of Chang'an in the Tang Dynasty that depicts the vast scale of courtyard complexes and surrounding corridors, huilang, that connect these structures, and says this shows that the comprehensive nature of design was unparalleled in the Tang Dynasty. And there's one more image here. This is a similar, also from Dunhuang, showing a Wutai Shan, where that temple we know that we looked up before is located. And this is from an image of Wutai Shan in Dunhuang, very far in western China. And he also notices the comprehensive scale of this. So people, like I mentioned, Nancy Steinhardt, her criticism is this must have just been a fantasy, that what we see from Chinese architecture is much more simple compared to the past. And there's not much correlation between these images and the actual temple, such as Fogong Si, which is actually portrayed. But it doesn't look much like Fogong Si temple is today. But something else she says is, so he's ignoring what actually did exist. Her argument is that Liang had a cultural bias with the Tongan, like I mentioned her quote, and he's ignoring things from, say, Japan at the time, like Falun Su, the Huoji Temple in Nara, you see here. And that from here we can understand more about Chinese architecture. Just, it's funny, in the essay where she says that, she quotes that article from 1932 and saying, unlike others now being mentioned Japanese architecture, actually, Liang Sicheng talks about this temple 9 times in that essay, where she says he totally ignores it. So he actually didn't ignore it. And, one of his last essays from 1963 was all about the relationship between Japanese architecture and Chinese architecture. He took that very seriously at the time. So, a little note about international scholarship too. This is Liang Sicheng with John Fairbank and Wilmer Fairbank, third wave man, engagement team. And they were collaborated very closely with Liang in ways they initially were friends getting into the 1930s when they were engaging. And they thought there was a bias against Chinese culture in the West, again, this idea that it was kind of non-scientific. And so this idea of structure was very important to both of them. That you have to understand, even in the Han Dynasty, in the Minhang, Wilma Fairbank did this rendering of it. She notices the structural division of the panels here and the relationship of the art to the structure. And basically they had a dialogue about this sketching. And their conclusion was that even the Han Dynasty, there was a real advanced understanding perspective. Even though this isn't the best perspective, they said if this existed there, you can imagine that in a Han court palace with all these very advanced perspective abilities. A lot of the Western scholarship at the time was saying, well, this creates a parallel Western levels of art in Greece and such. So they're fighting back about this bias at the time. And interestingly, that this idea that there is scientific perspective in China. Today, it's in the mainland. There are people like Zhao Chen are saying that we can't compare these two traditions, that to do so doesn't do service to China, because we need to be strong and independent now. And at the time, there was people in the West who said the same. It's a little bit difficult thing to explain, but Zhao Chen is saying that there's no need to compare rational portrayal of art and architecture to the West. At the time in the 30s, there were people in the West who were saying that to say Chinese art does not equal the West, or it's unknowable. In their way, that they were trying to respect the tradition. The view of Liang Sicheng again is that there is a rational basis to architecture design. It exists concretely. It needs to be understood in those terms and in terms of the old tradition. That those two are not in contradiction. We need to look at both of these areas. So I want to go quickly into basically a synthesis of Liang's ideas in these various forms. By the 1950s, Liang Sicheng thought very much that the past record could inspire design at present by how craftsmen of the past were dealing with their own challenges, not to mimic it, but also to inspire design. For instance, on the left is from the Yihuyuan. You notice when you go through Yihuyuan, the corridors, there's so much variation in every single sector. It looks the same in one hand, but every single design changes as you move forward in space. And this is understanding diversity do the same. And even in modern construction, like in Daqing Youtian, he believed that the traditional understanding of design could be used to solve the concrete problems of the time. For instance, lack of adequate space for heat. So he was very impressed with Daqing, but also believed that there's need for good designers, and maybe the Chinese tradition could play a role in an industrial site. It was one of his later ideas. Just a brief, very brief review, because we're kind of a little short on time. Over his career, right after Liu Peng, he designed the auditorium. He has a very formal view of the Dogon, with the brackets on top. Later, Liu Huiyin and Liang Sicheng designed the missing a character there. The Dogon here on the facade actually are not just formal, they play a structural role. That's because they were kind of advancing their ideas from, you can't just have formal architecture, but everything needs to play a functional role to be responsible and efficient, and it's part of their functionist ideology. And then in the Beijing Yunjing there's very little formalism at all, very modern design. And here's the UN building, which is, he took part of the competition for the UN in 1947. And a very interesting dialogue between architects at the time. He actually spoke up for the idea of Chinese orientation facing south, which is very controversial, because people wanted the UN to face the New York skyline like head on. But Liang Sicheng thought New York was too chaotic. So in the view of the other architects, he wanted the building to turn its back on the city. But also he thought, well, why not face the sun? That's worked for us for hundreds of years, and it should work for everyone. And he also thinks of the importance of kind of a corridor type of design, not based on Chinese aesthetic principles, but just on the idea of having self-enclosed space. A very interesting design, actually. And actually one of the respect and friendship of architects, in particular Oscar Niemeyer, and they became good friends as a result of this collaboration. Le Corbusier less so. Le Corbusier really was trying to take over the show. Liang gets criticized for this. It's not a real design. It's an idea of how you can use Chinese roofs on structures. In the 1950s, it became official policy to have official, it's called 社会主义内容民族形社, the National Forum of Socialist Content. And based on Stalin's understanding of the Soviet Union, there was a directive that you needed to have some principle that identifies something as Chinese. So Liang, even though he had criticized using so-called Chinese roofs in the past, he relented at this time. So that's maybe this is a way that we could preserve some part of the culture. It was a short period he got very criticized for that too, but it wasn't really his fault. It was the official policy to have this sort of approach. And I mentioned before, participation in mass projects, including in the Shui in 1957, 58. At the time, this is a sketch of the bracket form on the kind of the connection between the column and the roof. So you can see even his idea of brackets is being used in a very practical form here. So just a basic idea. This is his last design for. You can see Yangzhou, kind of a historical recreation based on Japanese Tang Jiao from the base Tang Dynasty temple in Nara. That he was a commemoration of the Chinese monk who went to Japan in the Tang Dynasty. But I just want to close here on this quote by Wang Shu, which tries to summarize a lot of the ideas that are being described here. The destruction of Wang Shu, of course, noted a Fisker architect in China. This is a quote from 2012. The destruction of the traditional urban fabric is a relatively recent phenomenon. Even the Chinese Revolution and the Cultural Revolution had left a great part untouched. The Great Destruction started in the 1990s, when the fast economic development driven by market liberalization started. Practically most of the old buildings have been destroyed, including my own work before that time. This fracture with our tradition has already been denounced in the 1930s by a great scholar, architect Liang Sicheng, the founder of the Shanghai University School of Architecture and Planning in Beijing. and a friend of the American planner Clarence Stein. He wrote a paper predicting that the future would bring great destruction. And they came with World War II, the revolution, and the contemporary urban explosion. He saw that the modern architecture was more interested in technique and technology and did not care about tradition, culture, and the arts. So I'll end there, but basically what's interesting about this quote is some people say Liang Sicheng was a frustrated modernist architect. Some people say he was always just a preservationist through and through. Wang Shu, I think, I agree with his understanding that he's actually not one or the other. He's playing with both sets in his work and his approach. And I think it's worth studying today. And for me and other students and colleagues, he continues to be very important to our work. And even on a mass level, there's extreme interest in China now for Liang Sicheng and what he's writing. And I hope that you all continue to learn about this and stay in touch. If you want to have more information, I suggest for those who read Chinese to read this essay by Yunjing, which says in much more detail some of the ideas which I've talked about here. And I'll end there. Please feel free to keep in touch, and I look forward to any questions or comments. So thanks for bearing with this broad presentation. So I don't know, do we have a microphone, or how are we doing questions? Or maybe we could just speak out. So feel free to ask a question or to have a criticism too, because this is dealing with a lot of questions and claims. And if you feel differently about it, feel free to speak up. One thing go ahead.
I have a question. Me and other classmates are actually doing a documentary about Shanghai, or building, or the history from the 1940s to modern day. And I actually just came back from Pianyu Avenue and actually saw here in Shanghai they're doing a lot of renovation, and they're actually keeping the building architecture. So I'm just wondering if you know anything about that, or here in Shanghai, you have so much construction happening around. Is there like thought being put to that?
There's definitely an effort to preserve the traditional architecture for Shanghai. There's this official policy that we don't want to use the architectural history of Shanghai. So there's a lot of thought behind that too. Our school plays a role even in people like Professor Tsai Kong and surveying sites and suggesting what should be preserved by the sites, and developers need to take that into account. So it's a big subject, but we can talk more about this.
Sure.
Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for your wonderful presentation. I wonder, because right now Dougong is not very commonly used in the architectures nowadays. Then, what's the meaning, or what's the contribution of Dougong for the current building construction?
Well, in a way, modern material makes it so you don't need to have you're not required to use the Dougong as you were before. But if you see let me go back to this slide from Fulong Temple, there's a certain engineering logic in the past construction which is very worth studying. Even just it's very, it's beautiful engineering-wise, the way that the Dougong, this is a section, so you don't see the Dougong in such detail here, but how they distribute the force very scientifically to the columns, for instance, and how they don't waste material in the Tang Dynasty. When there was need for more support around the columns, they're more broad, and when the intercolumn Dougong, they're smaller, so they save resources. There's a big debate in China and internationally that there's a lot of waste in construction right now. You can think of the Miao Hall, the Beijing Olympics as an example, so much steel. Actually, there was a friend when Liang Sicheng went to America in 1947, he met with a woman, Elizabeth Ma, who was head of the Museum of Modern Art, and she was writing a book about bridges. So she studied Liang Sicheng's understanding of Chinese bridges. And through that dialogue, in part, he says that maybe the best engineering comes when there's some scarcity. You have too much material, it's easy to waste, and the design becomes somewhat wasteful at times. So if at a minimum, understanding the Dougong and its way of building up the structure in one hand, distributing the forces another, for just some of the ways that we understand its design potential. People have also commented that Dougong potentially has a lot of use for the seismic role with earthquakes. It actually is very potentially useful in distributed forces too, and some people have studied that, particularly in Beijing in recent years. And also just the craft of the Dougong is very ancient and beautiful, how it's very modular. You have just basic units that fit together. You're able to expand in wide scales and up and down and side to side in a very innovative way. So I think I believe very much in Liang Sicheng's later ideas of his notes, he says, of a clumsy craftsman, modest. We can study the past for how people were solving problems at their time. Not necessarily to use exactly what they were doing, but at a minimum, to see how the designers, if you call it, the past, are thinking, to challenge our own ways to deal with our problems right now. So those are a few things, but that's just my 2 cents. I'm sure you guys not yours too, maybe. Does that make sense?
I think the idea is like we look at the history to further wisdom. But in some case, like as you said, in some like disasters or earthquakes, the logo is more resilient. Then why still there's no such kind of logo design in nowadays?
Yeah, if it's so resilient, if it's not, well, it's one of the arguments that people make for why didn't Liang Sicheng just study traditional architecture? He could have just worked with craftspeople and built Chinese buildings. And there's actually a scholar who I studied with in the US, Peter Rowe, who says that Chinese design is the opposite of what Liang Sicheng does. It's about the modular form of Dougong and building the column-based framework and then working rather than having an idea of a building first. It's a little bit of a complicated argument, but in essence, to build modern industrial buildings, particularly in the 20th century, you couldn't use Dougong in wooden construction. It wouldn't have worked on that scale. And that there's need to use the modern material. And so Liang Sicheng is very much a patriot, and he believes that first and foremost, he needs to use his architectural background to serve the needs of China. It is very much important to his own internal growth, more so than others people appreciate, including our Robert de Fairbanks at the time. He wanted him just to be a scholar, but he wanted to help the country. So this idea of being practical on one hand. There's also, I mentioned Humboldt, his criticisms. There is some idea, what is lost when you don't have the Dougong? It's not an easy answer. How useful is the Dougong? In some ways it's useful, in some ways it sometimes becomes somewhat wasteful itself. There's a lot of wood that's needed. And one of the arguments for the disappearance of the Dougong itself is after the Tang Dynasty, population increases and there's less timber. The forest get fewer. So you can't have as much wood in the buildings. So there's also a need to deal with that as well. It's very complicated. Some architectural history is so hard because there's so many different questions. Yeah. Can you speak up a little bit? I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sorry.
No.
I'm saying like in Chinese temples, usual axis would be where it was represented, like representation of the universe and sacred meaning of the universe in the Chinese temple. I cannot understand it, like it should be like a middle, right? Something like that.
If I understand you saying, what is the representation of the axis in the universe?
Like in Chinese temples, where it would be positioned.
Oh, what's the orientation of that?
Yeah.
Like in terms of north, south, east, west?
No, like a sacred representation of the center, where it would be usually represented.
The sacred representation of the center. Well, maybe I'm not understanding completely. There's definitely the idea of the relationship between heaven and earth.
Yes.
Can't do that in the temples. And actually,
Often in many, like usually in temples, there is some representation of the center, which would be the connection of the earth and heaven. And very often, like, is there anything like that in Chinese temple?
effect. So does that make sense?
So it can be like a music instead of just places in the park.
How the buildings work together, and they're often, especially in Wutai Shan, the Fulhong Temple, was they built in relationship to the mountain. And after the Northern Wei dynasty, the mountain becomes seen as a sacred place itself. So the temples have a very relationship and reference to the main peaks of the mountain. So the idea is that the Buddhist essence resides there at the time. Actually, the emissary, not Buddha itself, but the Manzari. So yeah, and then that changes as Buddhism changes in China too, especially in the main Qing. There's more of the Lamaistic influence from Tibet. So different Buddhist architecture that's a little different from that form too. So it's a very complicated history. Please, if you can, get in touch with, I have the contact in the end, and yeah, and be in touch, hopefully it helped. No, sometimes the best questions go in different directions. Any other, maybe if there's a lot of actually experts in the field in our school and professors, maybe some people have criticisms, because are there any criticisms of this that people have, or different perspectives? I could hear you, but maybe.
You can sit a little bit in the
Yeah.
front.
Can you hear me now? Like, is it quite audible?
It's okay.
Okay, so I'm just interested with your final slide. It says that construction of new buildings, they lack soul or they become empty shells. So I'm just curious whether, in terms of replicating ancient buildings, for example, in Korea, they have a lot of buildings that are being replicated, even though it's not the original traditional architecture, but they rebuilt it in a different form in order to preserve the culture. So I'm just curious about your views about this, about those replicated buildings. Do you think they are empty shells in that way, or do they serve some kind of like pragmatic purpose to actually preserve culture?
I'm just, because I don't have a great memory, I'm trying to read where it says about the empty shell. I think what Wang Shu is talking about here is more what's been lost in terms of the history that exists. There's a lot of efforts in recent years to build new buildings in China that are non-cultural history. It's probably official policy for a few years now. So there's many attempts in that direction. I think with the modern economy, it's objectively that a lot of the past structures in history have been lost. And every culture has different aspects to it. And Liang Sicheng, his view was there's kind of more of a, it's funny, he's accused of being interested in the monument by people like Zhao Chen, or people like in the West, I mentioned Nancy Steiner was one. But the reason he's interested in the monument is he really wants to preserve the building. He said, when it's lost, is what he says. So he's a little upset that the culture itself doesn't keep more of the building itself. So in that sense, he is somewhat of a, I wouldn't say monumental, but there's something unique. He thinks a little bit different from the culture, the dominant culture in his view. Though, actually, there's a book that came out recently by a scholar in Beijing named Yi Hao that saw a new document that Min and Liang Sicheng wrote to the center in 1950 about the planning of Beijing, where they said that the Soviet experts wanted to industrialize Beijing and have, I think it was 10% or 50% workers. And Liang said, we can do more than that, we can have 30%. Why do we have to be only restricted by the Soviet number? It's an example that he wasn't against all industrialization either. I'm kind of speaking a tangent from your question, but basically, there's a quote I want to read actually that gets at this by a criticism of them. It's hard to say the past, it's even harder to transmit the past. I think is one way to get at this. And there was a modernist at Tsinghua in 1955 named Zhou Li. I'm mispronouncing it. He was very critical of Liang Sicheng because he wanted to be a pure modernist. And his words, he says, Liang Sicheng has nothing but praise for traditional architecture and no criticism. He He thinks traditional architecture is utterly beautiful, forming a perfect idol, leading people to believe that copying it and wholesale mimicry is hard enough and critical creation impossible. Master Liang has frozen traditional architecture, outlining methods and regulations, that's reference to Yuzhou and Fa Shi, limiting his own design activities within these methods. The result being that the road for architecture becomes even more narrow. The results being that one gets enmeshed in a web of one's own spinning, as methods cannot completely resolve the question of the people of the new era. No wonder when designing high-rise architecture, new architecture, Master Liang himself says, difficulties jump out. That's a translation by me. If people want to see the original Chinese, I could send you. But I think even though I believe very strongly in Liang's approach, there's something to the criticism. It's very difficult to deal with a tradition that's based on a certain time and place and applying it to the present. And that's why I think by 1964, Liang was very much saying, we need to be creative and looking at the problem-solving approaches that this design reflected more than actually copying it. And actually, that is a real source for innovation of the present. Arguably, I think that's a very important idea for us. So I'm sorry to not answer so directly. But, yeah. We're almost at 1 o'clock, and people probably have classes to go to and things like that. So what are the moderators? Should we end there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for